Welcome to today's show, where we'll talk about how to make a great impression. Let's dive in. Chris sat down, watching the hustle and bustle around him, feeling like he jumped into a parallel universe and didn't get the memo about the dress code. He dashed outside to sell his scanner, but spotted a familiar face and sprinted after it, ending up chasing his wife onto a bus. Successfully retrieved his belongings, but Chris didn't sell a single scanner today now, he just has two. Wealth is overrated, right? Back home, his wife saw the extra equipment and imagined a life of endless trouble, so she resolved to escape this luxurious life. Subtitles. Chris hadn't yet perceived his wife's emotions, and with a sense of pride in his heart, he boasted about having saved a device today, determined to strike back against fate. However, his wife seemed indifferent, looking at him like he had loser tattooed on his forehead. Later that night, Chris heard on TV about a professor who could solve a Rubik's Cube in 30 minutes. This was the hot topic. Chris had a Rubik's Cube. Playing it, he had an insight, always nearly succeeding, yet never quitting. In his mind, the Rubik's Cube was the key to changing his life. Chris arrived at the company, waited for his boss to leave, then acted swiftly to showcase his skills. But his boss was in a hurry, ignoring him entirely. "Can I hitch a ride?" Chris brazenly squeezed into the car. He launched into a sales spiel but was ignored like air by his boss, absorbed in the Rubik's Cube. "Sorry, I'm focused on this now." Chris insisted he could solve the Rubik's Cube and started explaining the principles behind it. Even the driver got captivated and began playing with his own cube. "You can slow down. We could spin in circles all day as long as I believe you can't succeed." Chris chuckled. "Of course I can." Chris was like the Rubik's Cube inventor, confidently explaining while acting. The boss' attitude turned serious as Chris finished one side in a blink. "Oh my goodness." As other colors fell into place, the boss began to look at Chris with newfound respect as time ticked away. Approaching her destination, the boss remained blissfully unaware as all her focus was glued to Chris. Even the driver was afraid to interrupt them. "You're nearly there. It's 17.10. That's my stop." Subtitles. Wow. Chris has successfully made the supervisor remember this black guy who can solve the Rubik's Cube, and she is simply feeling so relieved. Seemed to have just aced an interview, but the boss didn't pay upon exiting, so she asked the driver to go back 2 blocks. I glanced at my wallet like a cheetah, peeked at the meter's rise, clutching my bag, potting boldly. When the red light hit, and the driver slammed the brakes, Chris leaped out like a superhero. Rushing off, Chris forgot the scanner, turned back like a bull, unstoppable by the driver. He sprinted all the way to the subway station, strutting his legs and stepping over fried chicken, just managing to catch the last subway train. But the scanner wasn't as fortunate as he was. Chris truly ended up with a loss, paying for the taxi fare in a completely different manner, as the cost of one scanner was equal to his entire month's living expenses. Too far to pick up his son, he asked his wife for help, but the goal became the final straw. His wife cut him off before he could explain, hanging up immediately. On the bus, Chris fell deep into self-doubt. Why does happiness run farther the harder I try? What's life's meaning? He dashed home, but his wife left with their son. The clothes around the house were a chaotic mess, and the poster of Alan Johnson on the wall hit him like a ton of bricks, considering his son's dream was to join the NBA. But in his heart, he didn't realize that he was really just a wannabe dad standing in the way of his son's NBA dreams. Suddenly, the phone rang. Chris expected his wife, but it was his boss, telling him to come for an interview the next morning and note the secretary's number. The assistant would provide the interview details, but since there was no pen at home, Chris humorously pretended to have one. He repeated the 14-digit phone number and 4-digit extension loudly, then rushed to the supermarket for the lucky number. Opportunities always favor the prepared, and Chris' quick thinking snatched this chance. The next day, Chris unexpectedly ran into his wife on the street, and they immediately started arguing. Subtitles. In the afternoon, when school was dismissed, Chris arrived at the daycare center ahead of time, intending to secretly pick up his son, because at this very moment, his son meant everything to him.
At night, the landlord returned, demanding eviction under the guise of wall painting. Chris reluctantly agreed to do it free. The landlord agreed to grant him a week's extension. He rose early to paint, joking on the wall, "Chris, you're done for." Another knock and the police arrived, creating a black comedy scene. Despite his car being towed, Chris felt uneasy. He wrote a check, but found out it needed to wait until morning at the bank to see if it would even clear. The problem? The interview was the next morning, and his son was still at daycare. So he had no choice but to humbly plead with his wife. In response, fate seemed to be laughing at him mockingly from the sidelines. Chris spent the whole night in the police station, on edge and not daring to rest a moment. The moment the bank confirmed the check's validity, he bolted out, covered all over in paint. So what? He simply couldn't afford to miss this chance. Thankfully, Chris made it to the interview just in time, even though all the other candidates were in suits. Despite looking disheveled, Chris smiled and shook hands, showing his fearless spirit. He joked, "I got detained by the cops for not paying my tickets, and trust me, I don't want to revisit." That humor lightened the mood instantly. Subtitles, however, as shareholders sitting nearby stared at Chris resume, frowned, and remarked, "Your high school education seems a bit inadequate." Once again, an awkward silence suddenly fell over everyone's attention. Chris made up his mind to take the initiative, shift the conversation topic, and win their favor through sincerity. This approach proved to be far more effective than any form of pressure.